Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We were just giving folks another minute or so to join. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat while we wait. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we take this opportunity to share with you some of the ways in which Room to Read has been exploring supporting children with developing social and emotional learning competencies through our literacy program. My name is Christabel Pinto. I am the Senior Director for the Global Literacy Portfolio, and I'm based in Oakland, California. So welcome. So I'm going to begin by doing a quick overview of SEL, what it is and why it is important to us. I'm going to talk about how literacy and SEL make quite a perfect pairing. I'm going to go through some examples from our book collection, and then I'm going to introduce some resources that are available for any folks who might want to use this in their programming. And then at the end, I'm hoping that there'll be some time for any Q&A, for any questions that we don't have time to respond to during the webinar, we will respond to over email later when we share the recording and the resources. So as, a quick summary of social and emotional learning, I thought I'd begin with this description of it from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which defines SEL as the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. These competencies are divided into these 5 areas. The first is self-awareness, the ability to recognize one's emotions, values, strengths, and challenges, and how these influence behavior. The second, self-management, managing your emotions, your thoughts, and your behavior, and achieving goals and aspirations, which can include being able to persevere in times of challenge. The third is social awareness, showing understanding and empathy for others. The fourth, responsible decision-making, making caring and constructive choices about our personal behavior and our social interactions. And then the fifth, relationship skills, establishing and maintaining healthy and supportive relationships. We often talk about these competencies at times of crisis. We think of children in crisis and then we're like, oh, we really need to support the SEL. But the reality is all children, whether in crisis or not, and all adults need to have strong SEL skills. Anyone who has been a teacher knows that if a child is struggling to manage their impulses, has difficulty persevering at times of challenge or when things are boring, have trouble with their peers and peer relationships, these kids are going to struggle to learn anything academic in the classroom, regardless of how scintillating your lesson plan may be or how strong their innate academic abilities might be. You need to have strong social and emotional learning skills in order to learn anything in the classroom. And then, if we really think about emotion, and how emotion drives attention and attention drives learning. And emotion also affects how we process and store new information. So for all of these reasons, SEL is important all the time, but it is something that we think about in a particular way in times of crisis. So COVID presented additional considerations for us to think about with respect to children's experiences. With schools closed, many kids were home and isolated. So this increased isolation came along with a decrease in access to social supports. Children's routines were disrupted, and this decreased the predictability of the future. And a lot of kids take a lot of comfort in being able to predict what comes next and having a routine. And then, COVID also for kids resulted in an increase in adverse childhood experiences, whether that is, experience of violence, witnessing violence, illness, death, and family dysfunction that comes along when families under greater strain, along with a decrease in access to buffers, particularly community buffers, like being engaged in sports teams or in faith-based activities outside of the home that could be supportive of children, when they're experiencing increased adverse childhood experiences. So we looked, at our literacy program, and we're really asking ourselves, what are some ways in which we can support children at this difficult time, in their social and emotional development? And then hopefully these ways would support them even into the future when we return to some kind of normalcy in their routines and their kind of learning schedules. So some of you may know that Room to Read has got two broad programmatic pillars. One pillar is our gender equality portfolio that focuses on adolescents. Within this pillar, Room to Read has extensive experience supporting the development of social and emotional learning for adolescents. But in this pillar, the literacy portfolio, which focuses on the early grades, so children in grade 1 and 2, it's been a very literacy-focused program. So we did not want to develop a program focus on SEL that would be a parallel program to our literacy portfolio. We have this literacy program. This is where we focus for the children in the early grades. However, given children's particular needs at this time, and given the importance of SEL at all times, we wanted to think about how we could use our existing literacy portfolio to support children in developing SEL skills. So when we looked at this portfolio that includes classroom instruction on literacy skills, it includes a library program where children have access to reading materials, but also includes book sharing, where teachers and librarians are sharing books with children. And then quality materials, the development of materials to support our instruction on our library program. When we looked at this, we could see two areas where we thought, these could be good areas to focus on supporting SEL. One is in the area of materials. Is this a particular thing that we can think about when we're developing materials for children? And then the second is our library program, where we're sharing books with children through read alouds. Could this process of book sharing and story sharing provide an opportunity to support SEL as well? So when we reviewed how children develop their skills within academic subjects and how they develop their skills within SEL, we noted that there were a lot of parallels. In this chart, I focused on literacy in particular because that's the focus of this presentation. But what I'm saying about literacy could apply to other academic subjects like numeracy as well. The learning of literacy and SEL both follow a developmental progression where children learn more basic skills and then continue to build on their skills and develop more and more complex skills. In both areas, skills are developed at home and at school in the context of supportive environments. In both areas, learning requires interaction. These skills are learned through listening, through observation, through direct instruction, through practice in different contexts, and trial and error. And then again, in both areas, feedback that's received from adults and others plays a really crucial role in furthering skill development. And for both areas, you benefit from having role models that demonstrate these behaviors. So this made for us the integration of SEL into the existing program that we have quite natural when we saw all of these parallels in how these skills are developed and how children learn them. And then, we realized that the added benefits of doing it in this way is that the skills that were learned would be experienced as integral to learning in life rather than something that's separate. So children's literature is, a central point for any literacy intervention for kids. You can't learn how to read if you don't have good books to read. It turns out that it's also an excellent tool to use to support social and emotional learning. Stories provide an entry point for children to experience difficult emotions within the safety of an imaginary world that's contained in the story that's in the book. In addition, stories are both mirrors and windows. So when we think about supporting children in both self-awareness and social awareness, right, having books that are mirrors that reflect their own experiences back at them can really support them in their own self-awareness. And at the same time, having books that are windows that expose them to communities and folks who are different, exposes them to folks who they may not meet ever in real life, and shows them kind of the diversity of the world and kind of grows them in their social awareness. And then stories expand opportunities for children to practice perspective taking, problem solving, emotional relating, and self-reflection. Read alouds are a core part of supporting children in developing literacy skills. The person who is reading is modeling good reading behavior and fluent reading practices. And it's an opportunity when you read it dialogically to teach vocabulary, to support children in their comprehension, and like helping them learn about the story arc when you're sharing stories. This type of reading and sharing of books is also really great for supporting social and emotional development. This kind of shared reading process is a social process. There's an interaction between the book creators, so the author and the illustrator, the characters in the book, the reader and the listeners. It involves emotional communication. The reader is bringing the story to life and expressing emotion through tone, pitch, facial expressions, gestures, pacing, volume. And this really holds children's attention. And then the questions that are asked in the process can direct children to have personal connections to the story, as well as support comprehension, while also supporting social and emotional learning. So I'm going to now go through a few of the examples that we have to kind of just go through some of the questions that you could ask if you wanted to support children in social and emotional learning while doing read alouds. So the first story that I'm going to use is Salma and the Orange Tree. Now, for this particular story, and for all of the examples that I'll be sharing, I'm not going to do a full read aloud of the entire book. Instead, I've selected some of the pages here, and I will do a summary of the book, just to give you a flavor of the story. So Salma was moving to a new place where she would be living in a tent. She really missed her home. With a piece of charcoal, she drew an orange tree to remind her of home. This tree provided endless delights in a number of different areas, like it had trunks to climb on, it had oranges, and in addition, it provided delightful shade, which you can see Salma enjoying here. She continued to draw orange trees, more and more orange trees. And these orange trees were much more than orange trees. When she was hungry, the oranges provided something to satisfy her. When it rained, the oranges provided shelter. When she was sad, her oranges could cheer her up. When she was lonely, her oranges provided music. When it was dark in the tent, the oranges lit up the tent with a warm and happy glow. And when she missed home, her oranges could help her fly up and away. So, if we wanted to support children's social and emotional development through using this story, during the read aloud process, the adult or whoever it is who is sharing the story with the child could tailor the questions in such a way to support particular skills within the realm of social and emotional learning. So here are some examples that I'm sharing with you, but I encourage you all to think of your own examples and feel free to write them in the chat. So one example to support self-awareness. How do you think Salma felt when she had to leave home and live in a tent? Why do you think she felt that way? How would you have felt if that same thing had happened to you? In the area of self-management, Salma uses drawing and her imagination to feel better. When you are sad, what can you do to make yourself feel better? Or Salma needs to have courage to deal with her new circumstance. What is something in your life that you need courage for? And then, of course, allowing space for sharing and discussion, responding to things that children say. And then social awareness. When Salma was feeling homesick, what is something you could say to her to help her to feel better? So I'm just going to pause there in case folks want a couple of minutes to think of maybe some other questions that you can think of to support these particular areas, and feel free to just share them in the chat. Okay, well, you'll have more opportunities to give this a try because I'm going to go over a few more stories with you. So this next story is called V's Special Gift. And this particular story was developed as part of Room to Read's global COVID-19 collection. In 2020, we pivoted our trainings to do global workshops with authors and illustrators. And we wanted to do a set of books developed globally. So we had contributors from countries, across all of our program countries to, really depict children's experiences during the time of COVID. So in this story, you will see, for example, children, folks wearing masks and being physically distanced because it's part of that collection. This particular story was inspired by rice ATMs, which dispensed free rice to folks who were out of work due to COVID-19 in countries in Southeast Asia. So the author and the illustrator were inspired by this, and that's what inspired this particular story. And we have this book in English translation, so you can see some of the pages in English. So V was running late, and she just made it to the line to get rice for her family. As she's standing in line, she notices that the child in front of her is really restless. He's tired, he wants to go home. But there's no option. He needs to stand in this line. There's no one at home to watch him, so he just needs to stand along with his mom. V realizes that she can help this child and says, okay, little boy, let me sing for you. And she knows just the right sweet song for such a day and proceeds to sing to the child to entertain him a little bit as he has to stand in this really long line. But the line really is endless and moves so slowly. So V then says, the little boy asks her, well, can you tell me a story? V says, well, even better. I'm going to read a poem to you. So she takes out a book and she reads a poem, continuing to try and help this child while away time while standing in this long and very boring line. The line continued to proceed, and V is really thoughtful about the needs of the people around her. She notices, for example, there's an elderly lady behind her. She says, Grandma, please go ahead of me. When she reaches the front of the line, very sadly, there is not enough rice. So she, stands in this long line and is suddenly faced with the reality of not having rice to take home to her family. And she just feels such utter dismay at the thought of not having rice to eat tonight and not having rice to take home to her family. When, to her great joy, the other folks in the line who had received rice rations each contributed a little bit of rice into V's bag so that she actually ended up having rice through the support of this community that she had been showing such kindness to while she was waiting in this line. So even in these difficult days, there is still giving, there is still sharing, there is still kindness. And she was delighted to run home with a bag of rice for her family. So again, here, you can really think about the kinds of questions this story, that could be used with this story to help children develop their social and emotional learning. So in the area of self-awareness, we're helping children learn about themselves. We could ask, what do you have in common with V? And in what way is your life different from V's life? In some ways, in the pandemic, children around the world had a lot of common experiences, mask wearing, social distancing, maybe increased chores for their families, right? That, there is still a lot of commonality between a child in Vietnam and a child in Oakland, California, when it comes to this particular period of time. And then other ways, their lives are really different, right? So having children reflect on this supports them in learning more about themselves, while at the same time learning about others. Self-management, right? So in this particular story, V and her community needed to be very patient as they stand in a very long rice ATM line. This could be an opportunity to reflect on patience with kids. When do you need to use patience in your everyday life? Relationship skills. In this story, V demonstrates a lot of kindness to the folks that she's waiting in line with, and they demonstrate kindness right back to her, right? So what are some ways in which V showed kindness to others? And what are some things you can do to be a good playmate, a classmate, or a friend? So, again, I invite you to share any questions you think about with respect to this particular story. If any come to mind, feel free to share in the chat. Questions that you could ask children that would both support their comprehension of the story, while at the same time supporting social and emotional learning. And I know it can sometimes take a time to come up with these questions. So if nothing occurs to you, that's fine. But if a question came to mind, we wanted to encourage you to share it with each other. Responsible decision-making. At the start of the story, V was running late, and this mistake nearly cost her the opportunity to get rice for her family. That's a very costly mistake, to not have food to take home for your family. What is a mistake that you have made, and what did you do to fix it? And I can see there's some examples that Anne has shared in the chat. When do you need to be patient? Do you have a song or story you tell yourself? That's great. Great examples. Thanks, Anne, for sharing. And we encourage other folks to continue to share questions as they come to you. Oh, great one here from Carrie. The other people in the line helped V by giving her some rice. What is something you have done to help someone else? Great. Keep them coming. Oh, one for self-awareness. The little child was having challenges waiting in line. Do you ever feel restless as well? Can you give me an example? Thanks, Cassandra. Yeah, so feel free to keep the questions coming, and you'll have a couple more opportunities to think of questions with the next couple of stories. Okay. So this story is called Tiger's Trouble with Sewing. Tiger wants to make the perfect ao dai for the Lunar New Year. He keeps trying, but can't seem to get it right. First, it's way too small. Then it's way too big. Then the proportions are wrong. He keeps trying and trying and trying. Finally, he tears the ao dai off in anger and screams, "Not again!" Then he calms down, works very carefully, takes one step at a time, and sews a perfect ao dai that fits him just perfectly. What is he going to do with the rest of the ao dai, the ones that didn't fit? It turns out that he found a perfect use for them. He had many friends of different shapes and sizes who could use those ao dai, and they could all celebrate the Lunar New Year together. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about this story and the kinds of questions that you might ask to support social and emotional learning. So there was, when I think about some of the elements of the story, there was extreme frustration and anger at trying something over and over again and it not working out. There is some persistence, as Tiger keeps trying. There's some self-management of emotion as Tiger, breathes in, calms down, and goes step by step to find a solution to the problem. So just think about what are some of the questions that you might ask to support a child's social and emotional learning. And as you are thinking, and feel free to share in the chat, I will share a few examples. So with self-awareness, Tiger is angry when he cannot get the ao yai to fit. What is something that would make you feel angry? What feelings do you notice in your body when you feel angry? Or also to support self-awareness, Tiger celebrates Lunar New Year. What is a special holiday that you celebrate and how do you celebrate it? And then self-management. After a few attempts, Tiger finally figured out how to make an ao yai that fits. What is something that you can do now that you weren't able to do before? And how did you learn to do it? Or Tiger could have felt discouraged after failing multiple times. Have you ever felt discouraged? How did you keep going? And there's an example in the chat. Thanks, Franca. Have you tried doing something and failed many times? Do you give up trying? How do you feel when you finally figure out what is right? Or from Christy, Tiger loves sharing with his friends. Oops, the chat moved but that's great. Tiger loves sharing with his friends. What do you like to share with your friends or family? How do you feel when you share with others? These examples are great. Thank you, everyone. Christoph, Tiger didn't exactly know how to make an ao yai. Who could he have asked to help him learn? And then Alka is kind of sharing the themes here of sharing, togetherness, and fun, all around sewing skills. And then from Irene, what makes you happy? These are great examples. Thanks, folks. Continue to share. Those are great. And then with responsible decision-making, Tiger tore off one of his ao yai in anger. What would have been the consequence of tearing up all the wrong ao yais? What did Tiger choose to do with the extra ao yais instead? So I'm going to take one last look at the chat in case there are a few more examples. Oh yes, there's some great examples here. Have you ever made something that didn't work out quite as you had hoped? What did you do with what you had made? That's great. Tiger lost his temper. What do you do to calm down if you lose your temper? What great examples. Thanks, folks. And then in this example, it's the final example. This story is called Brave Rima. Rima was so excited to go to the Boishaki fair with her uncle. It was so full of color, so many things to do. There were so many shops, so many things to see. I mean, it looks like here that her uncle is having a hard time keeping up. Suddenly, she looked up and uncle wasn't with her. She was really upset, but she didn't lose courage. She said to herself, I know how to find lost things. I'll explore the fair and look for uncle. She called out and she looked everywhere. Finally, She saw a man wearing the same orange Punjabi as her uncle. She was delighted to have found him, only to find that it wasn't her uncle. When he turned around, she was like, "You're not my uncle." And she continued her rounds around the fair looking for her uncle when she encountered a crying child. And she asked this little boy, "What's wrong? How can I help you?" It turns out the little boy was lost too. Rima helped the little boy find his parents and then turned and saw, "Uncle, there you are. I've been looking for you everywhere." And Uncle said, "I've been looking for you everywhere." And they were happily reunited. So once again, I invite you to share your questions in the chat about what kinds of questions you would ask for this story that would, support comprehension while at the same time supporting social and emotional learning development. So the example that I have here on self-awareness, Rima got lost in a crowded fair. What strengths did she demonstrate as she found a solution to her problem? And then what are your strengths? And then allow children an opportunity to share their strengths and the things that they're good at. For social awareness, what do you think Rima was thinking and feeling when she found herself separated from her uncle? For responsible decision-making, what did Rima do to solve her problem? What are some ways in which she could have reacted that would have made her situation worse? And then also, on the flip side, is there anything Rima could have done that she did not do? So I'm just going to pause in case any folks want to add any questions in the chat that you think of for this story. You can continue to give it some thought and put in any questions you think of in the chat. So the general tips then would be, I tried to model this in the sample questions that I shared, but I know that some of you did the same thing in the questions you shared in the chat. But you want to draw attention to the experiences, feelings, and thoughts of a character in the story as a way to anchor the questions about students' own experiences. And then generally, this is good for all read alouds, but especially important if you're trying to support social and emotional learning development. Encourage students to be curious, to wonder, to ask questions. Encourage a diversity of opinions and responses. There's often multiple different answers are correct. And then respond non-judgmentally. And then ideally, you'd want to follow up with some kind of an activity for integration. In addition to trying to support SEL through read alouds, we also developed worksheets that could accompany some of these read alouds and encourage children to, draw their emotions, write about their emotions, write about things they're grateful for, right? After all, literacy is not just about reading, it's also about writing. So we could use the full scope of the literacy program to support children in developing their literacy skills, while at the same time supporting their social and emotional learning. So I'm now going to introduce a couple of resources that are available to folks for whom they could be helpful, and which we'll share along with the recording of the webinar. One is a resource on social and emotional learning through read alouds. And, it was developed as guidance for educators, but can be adapted for use with community members and parents. It includes for each competency a definition, indicators for how to know whether the skill is less developed or more fully developed, and then how to practice the skill during read alouds. And then additionally, it also includes 10 questions that can be used for any book to support self-awareness. So for each of the 5 competencies, there's a table to kind of give you an overview on it, as well as 10 questions to start you out in thinking about how to frame questions for kids around books to support that particular competency. The second resource is a book list to support social and emotional learning. As you can imagine, assigning a book to one particular competency is a little bit of a false categorization, because a single story could be used to support multiple social and emotional learning competencies. But, to start you out, we have categorized books within particular competency areas, but that you can use them for multiple competency areas. And then it's like just a final thought, we have been thinking about how a literacy program can be used to support social and emotional learning. But, in addition to that, like one of the reasons why this makes such a good pairing is that when children develop their literacy skills, they can apply them in the service of social and emotional learning. So, I've just included this quote here. As children experience more sophisticated forms of language and literacy, such as using longer sentences and a larger diverse vocabulary, they build increasingly complex communication skills and use them to express needs, feelings, and ideas to interact with others. I'd like to acknowledge the support of Krista Tenari from Peace Praxis, who worked with us on developing the content of these resources. Chelsea St. Cyr for her design support on the resources, and then Avisha Rogers, Brigitte Dean, and Patrick Curry for their behind-the-scenes support of this webinar. A lot of these books and many more can be found on literacycloud.org, so we encourage you to explore. And thank you. At this point, we can open up for questions and comments. Feel free to use the chat. And yeah. Okay. So let's see. So we have a question from Alka on, are these books bilingual? The books aren't bilingual, but they're available in both languages. So the books are developed in local languages. So you will find the original local language version on Literacy Cloud. But in addition, we have the English translated versions as well. So you should find those on Literacy Cloud as well. Let's see, more questions. Okay, let's see. Seeing a few that are coming in the chat. Okay, all right, so would you recommend giving the same guidance to parents, caregivers, and teachers to support children's SEL? Or are there different ways that families and teachers should approach SEL? I'd say that for using the general prompts and the idea of catering your questions to support SEL, this idea is similar for both teachers and for caregivers. But with caregivers, one of the things to keep in mind is that it might not be around a particular read aloud because if the caregiver's literacy skills are, not developed enough that they can actually read the story, they might be telling a story verbally. You could apply the same kind of questioning strategy with kids through a story that you're telling and not one that you're reading. I'd say the other difference is that with caregivers, it's probably likely going to be more of a one-on-one interaction, or maybe one-on-two if there's like multiple siblings in the home. Whereas with a teacher, we're supporting a teacher to do this kind of read aloud and sharing with a classroom of kids, and how you manage multiple responses from a big group of kids is different from how you manage a response from just one child. So these are the sorts of considerations I'd make when working with different folks, really taking into account literacy levels, taking into account the kind of situation they're in, taking into account the circumstance, right? Are children in crisis in that particular moment, or is this ongoing support for children's skills? So those are the kinds of adaptations. I would even adapt the wording of the questions to make them simpler or more complex, depending on the age of the child, the experience of the child in talking about topics like this, right? Start really simple, thinking about the developmental progression, and then you can get increasingly more complex. Okay, let me see. Other questions. A question from Anne. I think it's great to layer SEL onto literacy work, asking questions that might support SEL. But I'm wondering whether you've been able to actually track how this has translated into improved SEL competencies. Not yet. This is a really new body of work for us. We just developed these resources last year and have begun using them primarily in our programs in South Asia. But we didn't want to wait until we had, evidence of learning before we shared them more widely, in the hopes that other folks might find them useful for your own programs. So, but we would like to be able to, especially as schools open and we have more access to kids and teachers than we've had in the past, which will make assessment a little easier than it has been in the time of COVID, when it's been really hard to reach children and their educators. So not yet, but looking forward to learning more, and welcome learning from all of you, who might try something like this, and kind of evidence that you collect from your efforts. For now, what we have is just anecdotal evidence. So in our programs in South Asia, this was last year, so a lot of the schools were not open yet. So our focus, our entry point, was working with families and parents. So there was anecdotal evidence from parents and children who found it helpful to have this way of interacting around books with each other. But we hope to be able to layer on more learning opportunities from these kinds of supports and intervention. So let's see. So I guess, Moazem kind of has a related question on how to measure the outcomes of SEL questioning in a read aloud strategy. So this is an area that we want to explore. Ideas that you have are very welcome. There are other organizations who have been working on measuring SEL. We can look to see what we at Room to Read can learn from our measurement approaches in our gender equality portfolio with adolescents, and see what we could apply to this younger range of kids. But our priority was to provide as much support to children as quickly as we could, given the situation that they were in. So we didn't have the luxury of time to develop ways to measure and to kind of do this kind of initiative the way we might have done it in usual times. We recognized that kids were in great need, and really were just like quickly moving to see what we could do that could support them using our existing program. But if you have ideas or resources on supporting, on measuring SEL, please feel free to share them in the chat so that we can all learn from each other. I'm sure there's a lot of resources out there, and we will be drawing on them as we continue to further our work in this area. Okay, a question from Samira. Do you do any type of comprehension testing on the SEL content with kids to see if they understand certain emotions and how they interpret the meaning? And second, do you have specific content for children in refugee or IDP communities? So on the first question, such a great question, and I think I've responded to that in that this is an exciting area to learn from. And I've just begun working in this area and begun trialing these resources with parents and families and kids. So at this point, we have anecdotal evidence, but we look forward to being able to learn more. And then the specific content for children in refugee or IDP communities. The specific content we have for those, I mean, a lot of those books that support children with that experience, we have from our collection in Jordan. So Salma and the Orange Tree is one of the books in that collection of a child who is displaced and has to leave home and now has to live in a tent. As you could see from the illustrations, like she was living in a refugee context. So we have some of the books that we've developed that specifically cater to children who have been displaced, whether through war or other reasons, and their experiences depicted in the story in a way that we hope is supportive of children's social and emotional learning, and just social and emotional well-being, like the Salma and the Orange Tree book being an example. But there are other examples, and if you'd like to reach out later, using my email, I'd be happy to share like more specific examples, or you can also just explore on literacycloud.org. So, okay. How can these stories be more inclusive to children with a vision disability? Yeah, such a great question, right? Like we would like these stories to be inclusive and available to all children, regardless of their background and regardless of their abilities. And, we look to have partnerships with others who have experience in developing materials for children with diverse needs. Within the context of our program, try and diversify the content of the books to the extent that we can. We have begun adapting some of our books, through we've had some books that are signed for children who are deaf. But for children with vision disabilities, that's a whole different layer of expertise to develop books in Braille, for example, for children to be able to read them. And it's not an expertise that we have, but we recognize just how important that is. So if there are others who have that expertise and are interested, in supporting that kind of work, we would love to hear from you and hear your ideas and explore potential partnerships to be able to take that kind of work forward. But it is really important, and that is, these books not being available in Braille, for example, does miss out a group of kids who would otherwise be able to access them. Okay, other questions. Okay, so the books that are available on Literacy Cloud are openly licensed. So there's a few different questions on licensing and use. As are the resources that we'll be sharing with you, the ones that I introduced, they're openly licensed with a non-commercial license. So we want these books and resources to be available to as many children as possible. And we welcome your use of these materials in service of supporting children's literacy and overall learning and well-being. Okay, let's see. There's a comment. Oh, yes, Irene. Yeah, I worked for Save the Children, so I remember that tool. But there is a social and emotional learning assessment tool that Save the Children had developed. I don't know the latest in terms of its use, but that's definitely a resource that we could look into to be able to measure social and emotional learning. Thanks for reminding us about that resource, Irene. So a question from Daniel. I suspect that in comparison to trying to add a separate SEL curricular content or modules, that this approach is more efficient and effective. It's more easily appropriated by teachers of any qualifications and readily appreciated by them. Do you yet have any systematic feedback from the teachers with whom you have implemented it? So last year, a lot of the schools were still closed. Last year, the Delta variant was raging in many of our program countries. And so our entry point to working with children tended to be largely with families. We did have some contexts, like for example, in India, where teachers went from home to home, fully masked, to support families in the use of the resources that we had developed for them. So teachers went door to door to provide supports to families in their community. But for the most part, we were really focusing on families directly because this was our entry point to children. We really look forward to now, as more and more schools are opening in our countries of programming, we really look forward to working more directly with teachers, to having kind of explicit support around this area, and then getting their insights and their feedback as they try this out in their classrooms. I agree with you, Daniel. I think that teachers will really appreciate having something that's integrated into what they're already doing, right? Like the questions that we generated here together today, not only support social and emotional development, but they actually support comprehension. So when teachers are doing read alouds, they want to support comprehension. So this is a very natural part of what we're already working with them on doing, but just supporting them and kind of shifting how they ask questions or the kinds of questions they ask to support social and emotional learning specifically, right? So I agree that the more we can integrate, the more it's appreciated by teachers. We keep asking teachers to do more and more, with very limited time. And that's just not realistic. So how can we integrate any new content and make it feel seamless and natural? And that was our goal here. Okay, we are just come up to the end of time. And I know that we didn't quite get to all questions, but I want to be respectful of folks' time and make sure that we end on time. So for any questions that didn't get answered, we'll do our best to answer them over email when we share the recording. Feel free to also email me if you have any questions. My email is up here on the slide. Or any follow-up, and I'd be happy to respond then. And then I really end with thanks on behalf of the Room to Read team. Thank you for joining us today, and really appreciated your insights in the chat, your questions for things to think about, resources that you shared. We've really appreciated this opportunity to learn from you. So thank you very much for joining.